The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood up, her tiny finger pointing directly at the judge presiding over the custody case. Her voice, clear and unwavering, echoed in the room. "You're my dad." Gasps rippled through the crowd as heads turned toward the judge, his face frozen in a mix of shock and disbelief. Whispers broke out among the attendees, their words an indecipherable hum beneath the weight of the girl's declaration. The judge's gavel hung in midair, forgotten, as he stared at the child with wide eyes. "Emily, what are you saying?" her mother stammered, breaking the silence. But Emily didn't flinch, her big blue eyes locked on the judge, who seemed unable to respond. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Then the judge finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. What did you just say, little one?" Emily repeated it, her voice louder this time, more certain. "You're my dad." The room seemed to hold its breath. Who was this little girl? Why would she say something so shocking? And most importantly, was it true? 2 months earlier, in a small town in Ohio, Emily Turner lived with her mother, Sarah. Their life wasn't easy. Sarah worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Emily often spent long hours at the daycare after school. Despite their struggles, Emily was a bright and happy child, always making friends and spreading joy wherever she went. But behind her sunny smile was a question she asked often and never got a clear answer to. "Mom, where's my dad?" Sarah would look away every time, her voice soft and evasive. "He's not with us, honey. He had to leave." Emily didn't understand what that meant, but she could tell it made her mom sad. So she stopped asking. One day, while Sarah was at work, Emily found an old box in the closet. Inside were pictures, letters, and a few keepsakes. Most of it didn't make sense to her, but one photograph caught her attention. It showed her mom, much younger, standing next to a tall man in a suit. He had kind eyes and a warm smile. Something about him felt familiar. "Is this my dad?" she whispered to herself, clutching the photo tightly. She didn't show the picture to her mom. Instead, she tucked it under her pillow and looked at it every night before going to bed. Meanwhile, Sarah's life was becoming more complicated. Her ex-husband, Greg, was fighting for custody of Emily, claiming Sarah wasn't providing a stable environment. Greg was a wealthy businessman, and his lawyers were relentless, painting Sarah as an unfit mother. The court date was set, and Sarah was terrified. She couldn't afford a fancy lawyer, and Greg's team seemed determined to tear her apart. All she wanted was to keep Emily safe and happy. As the court date approached, Emily began to notice her mom acting differently, quieter, more stressed. One evening, she heard her crying in the kitchen. Emily tiptoed in and hugged her mom tightly. "Don't be sad, Mommy," she said. "I'll help you." Sarah smiled through her tears, kissing Emily's forehead. "You already do, sweetheart. You're my sunshine." The day of the court hearing arrived. The room was packed with lawyers, family members, and curious onlookers. Emily sat quietly next to her mom, clutching a stuffed bunny for comfort. She didn't understand much of what was happening, but she knew it was important. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. He was tall and imposing, with a stern face and sharp eyes. But when Emily looked at him, her heart skipped a beat. He looked just like the man in the photograph under her pillow. As the hearing began, Emily couldn't stop staring at the judge. There was something about him that felt right, like he wasn't a stranger at all. The case went on for hours, with lawyers arguing back and forth. Emily didn't understand most of it, but she could tell her mom was nervous. Sarah's voice trembled when she spoke, and Greg's lawyers kept interrupting her. Emily squeezed her bunny tighter. She didn't like seeing her mom like this. Then, just as the judge was about to make his ruling, Emily stood up. Her small voice cut through the noise, drawing everyone's attention. "Wait," she said, her heart pounding. The room fell silent as she pointed at the judge. "You're my dad." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to take notes, lawyers shouted objections, and Sarah's face turned ghostly pale. Emily didn't understand why everyone was so upset. She just knew she was telling the truth. The judge's gavel finally came down with a loud bang, silencing the room. "Order! Order in the court!" he commanded, his voice firm. He turned to Emily, his eyes softening. "Young lady, why do you think I'm your father?" Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out the photo she had found. "Because of this," she said, holding it up for everyone to see. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Greg's expression darkened, and the judge froze, staring at the picture as if he'd seen a ghost. For a moment, no one said anything. Then the judge leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Where did you get that picture?" he asked. Emily looked at her mom, confused. "From our closet," she said. "Mommy, is he my dad?" All eyes turned to Sarah, who looked like she might faint. The truth was out, and there was no going back. What would the judge do next? Would he admit the truth? Or would he deny it and continue with the case? And what did this mean for Sarah and Emily's future? The answers lay in the hands of a man who might not just decide the case, but change their lives forever. The courtroom remained silent, every eye glued to Sarah as she stared at the picture in Emily's hand. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Emily's question hung in the air like a heavy cloud, threatening to burst. The judge, too, seemed frozen. His gaze darted between Emily, Sarah, and the photo. Finally, he cleared his throat, though his voice came out quieter than before. "Miss Turner," he said, his words deliberate, "I believe the court deserves an explanation." Sarah's knees wobbled as she stood, clutching the edge of the table for support. Her eyes were rimmed with tears, but she didn't look away from the judge. I didn't think this would ever come up," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "That photo, it was taken a long time ago." The room was so quiet you could hear the scribble of a reporter's pen. "I met you," she continued, looking directly at the judge, "when I was a young waitress in Cleveland. You were in law school, working part-time at the diner where I worked. We were close for a while." The judge's stern expression softened slightly. "Go on," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. Sarah took a deep breath, clutching her hands together to stop them from shaking. "I found out I was pregnant after you left to take a summer internship in another state. I tried to contact you, but by then, you'd moved. I didn't know where you were, and I didn't have the resources to find out. I decided to raise Emily on my own." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, but his hands gripped the edges of his bench tightly. "You're saying you believe Emily is my child?" he asked, his tone measured, though his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions swirling within him. "Yes," Sarah admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know you'd become a judge. I didn't even know you were here in Ohio until today. I never planned for any of this to come out like this. I was just trying to protect her." Emily, who had been listening quietly, looked up at her mom with wide eyes. "Mommy, why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah knelt beside Emily, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I didn't want you to feel like you were missing something, sweetie. I thought I was doing the right thing." Emily frowned, clutching her stuffed bunny. "But I wasn't missing anything, Mommy. I just wanted to know who he was." The judge closed his eyes for a moment, collecting his thoughts. When he opened them, he addressed the court. "We'll need to take a brief recess," he announced, his voice steady but strained. "Court will resume in 30 minutes. He banged his gavel and swiftly exited the courtroom, leaving the rest of the room in a buzz of speculation and whispers. Sarah sank back into her seat, her face pale and drawn, while Emily clung to her arm. In the judge's chambers, David Lawson, now no longer just the judge, but potentially Emily's father, paced back and forth. His mind was racing. He remembered Sarah clearly now, the kind-hearted waitress who had laughed at his terrible jokes and believed in his dreams even when he doubted them himself. But could it really be true? Could he have a daughter he'd never known about? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was his clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "Your Honor, are you all right?" she asked gently. "I don't know, Janice," he admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. This changes everything." Janice hesitated, then said, "If I may, sir, perhaps it's worth asking for a DNA test. That would give you some clarity." David nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, though his voice was distant. "We need answers. For everyone's sake. Back in the courtroom, Sarah was sitting quietly with Emily when Greg stormed over, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, keeping his voice low enough to avoid attracting attention. "You're seriously going to let some sob story derail this case? You think that judge is going to swoop in and play hero now?" Sarah glared at him, her usual timidity replaced with a fierce protectiveness. "I don't know what's going to happen, Greg," she shot back, "but I'm not going to let you bully me anymore. Emily deserves the truth, no matter how messy it is." Greg sneered. "The truth? The truth is, you're an unfit mother, and I'm going to prove it. Judge or no judge." Emily, sensing the tension, clung to Sarah's arm. "Mommy, is he going to take me away?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah hugged her tightly. "No one's taking you away, baby. I promise." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was even more charged. Judge Lawson returned to the bench, his face calm but serious. He addressed the courtroom. "Given the unexpected developments in this case, I'm ordering a DNA test to determine the paternity of Emily Turner. This is not a decision I take lightly, but it's necessary for the truth to come to light." Gasps echoed through the room again, but the judge raised his hand to silence them. "We will adjourn until the results are available. In the meantime, both parties are expected to abide by the existing custody arrangement." With that, he banged his gavel and exited the room, leaving everyone in stunned silence once more. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah felt a mix of relief and dread. The truth was finally coming out, but what would it mean for her and Emily? Would the judge accept his role in their lives, or would he turn away? And as for Greg, he didn't look defeated. If anything, he looked more determined than ever, his jaw set in a way that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Emily, meanwhile, walked out of the courtroom holding her mom's hand, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. She looked up at Sarah and said, "Do you think he's really my dad, Mommy?" Sarah paused, her heart aching. "I don't know, sweetheart. But no matter what, I'm here for you. Always." The next step was clear, the DNA test. But what would the results reveal? Would they bring the family closer together, or tear them apart forever? The days leading up to the DNA test felt like a blur to Sarah. Every moment was filled with tension, as though the world were holding its breath. Emily, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her, carried on with her usual brightness, her laughter echoing through their small apartment. But Sarah couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on her chest. Greg, on the other hand, seemed to revel in the drama. He sent curt emails through his lawyer, reminding Sarah of the consequences if the case didn't go in his favor. Each message felt like a jab, a reminder of how much power he believed he held. The test itself was a simple procedure, but the implications were anything but. Sarah and Emily sat in a small clinic room with Judge Lawson, David, as Sarah now privately referred to him in her mind. Emily, always curious, asked questions the entire time. "Does it hurt, Mommy?" she asked as the nurse swabbed her cheek. "Not at all, sweetie," Sarah assured her, brushing a hand over her hair. David watched them quietly, his usual composed demeanor softening as he observed Emily. There was something unmistakably familiar in her mannerisms, the way she tilted her head when she was curious, the way her smile lit up her face. It stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't quite put into words. When his turn came for the cheek swab, Emily giggled. "You look funny with that stick in your mouth," she said, earning a rare smile from the man who might be her father. The waiting was excruciating. The lab had promised results within 3 days, but each hour felt like an eternity. Sarah spent most of her time trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Emily. They baked cookies, went to the park, and watched cartoons together. But when Emily was asleep, the weight of uncertainty would crash down on Sarah like a tidal wave. One evening, Sarah found herself staring at the photograph Emily had discovered. It was a snapshot of a happier time, a fleeting moment when she believed the future was full of promise. She traced the outline of David's face with her finger, wondering what kind of man he'd become. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was an email from Greg's lawyer, filled with thinly veiled threats about how unstable households often lost custody battles. Sarah slammed the phone down, her frustration bubbling over. "I'm not letting him win," she muttered to herself. "Not this time." Meanwhile, David was grappling with his own emotions. His role as a judge demanded impartiality, but this situation was anything but ordinary. He replayed Sarah's words over and over in his mind, her tearful confession echoing in his thoughts. Could it really be true? Could he have a daughter he'd never known about? Janice, his trusted clerk, noticed his distraction during court proceedings. "You're thinking about the Turner case, aren't you?" she asked one afternoon. David sighed, rubbing his temples. "How could I not? If the DNA test confirms it, my entire life changes." Janice gave him a sympathetic smile. "Maybe it's not just about your life, sir. Maybe it's about hers." On the third day, the call came. Sarah's heart raced as she answered the phone. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, but every word felt like a hammer striking an anvil. "The results are in," the woman said. "I'm sending them to the court now." Sarah thanked her and hung up, her hands trembling. She glanced at Emily, who was coloring at the kitchen table, completely unaware of the magnitude of what was about to happen. "We're going to be okay," Sarah whispered, as much to herself as to her daughter. The courtroom was packed again as the results were revealed. David sat at the bench, his face composed but his hands gripping the edges tightly. Sarah sat with Emily on one side of the room, while Greg and his team occupied the other. David cleared his throat, unfolding the paper that held the answer everyone was waiting for. "The results of the DNA test," he began, his voice steady but laced with tension, "confirm that I am Emily Turner's biological father." The room erupted into a cacophony of gasps, whispers, and shocked exclamations. Sarah closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as relief and fear collided within her. Emily, sensing the importance of the moment, but not fully understanding it, looked up at her mom. "Mommy, what does that mean?" she asked. "It means he's your dad," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking. On the bench, David sat frozen, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He looked at Emily, who was staring back at him with wide, curious eyes. "I have a daughter," he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the full weight of their meaning. Greg's reaction was swift and furious. He stood abruptly, pointing an accusing finger at Sarah. "This is absurd," he shouted. "You planned this, didn't you? You've been scheming to manipulate the court." David banged his gavel, his voice sharp and commanding. "Enough, Mr. Mitchell. Sit down, or you'll be held in contempt." Greg reluctantly sat, his face a mask of barely contained rage. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but Greg waved him off, too furious to listen. David turned his attention back to Sarah and Emily. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice softer now, "I need some time to process this, but I want to speak with you and Emily privately before we proceed with any further rulings." Sarah nodded, her voice shaky. "Of course." Later that day, in a small meeting room adjacent to the courtroom, David sat across from Sarah and Emily. He looked at Emily, who was playing with her stuffed bunny, then at Sarah, who looked both relieved and terrified. "I don't know how to begin," he admitted, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I never imagined this." "I didn't either," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping quiet. I didn't want to disrupt your life." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "My life may be complicated, but Emily deserves to know her father. And I want to know her." Emily looked up at that, her eyes lighting up. "Does that mean you'll come to my birthday party next week?" she asked innocently. David's lips curved into a small smile. "I'd like that," he said, his voice soft but genuine. As they left the courthouse that day, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. The truth was out, and while it had brought new challenges, it had also brought hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't fighting this battle alone. But as they stepped into the parking lot, Greg's car pulled up beside them. He rolled down the window, his expression cold and calculating. "This isn't over, Sarah," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not by a long shot." Sarah hugged Emily tighter, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let Greg intimidate her. Not now. Not ever. The battle wasn't over, but Sarah was ready to fight. For Emily, for the truth, and for the family she never thought she'd have. Greg's parting words hung heavy in Sarah's mind as she and Emily drove home from the courthouse. Though she tried to stay calm for Emily's sake, her heart raced with the possibilities of what Greg might do next. He wasn't one to give up easily, especially when he felt his control slipping away. "Mommy, can we make cupcakes tonight?" Emily asked from the back seat, her cheerful voice a reminder of the innocence Sarah was fighting to protect. Sarah forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Anything you want." Emily's face lit up, and she clutched her stuffed bunny close. "And maybe we can save one for Judge David. Do you think he likes cupcakes?" Sarah's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "I think everyone likes cupcakes," she said, her voice soft. But deep down, she couldn't stop thinking about the storm brewing around them. David Lawson sat in his office long after the courthouse had emptied for the day. The DNA test results sat on his desk, but he didn't need to look at them again. The truth was undeniable. Emily was his daughter. He thought back to the little girl's bright eyes and infectious smile. How could he have missed so many years of her life? Regret gnawed at him, but alongside it was a growing determination. He had a daughter now, and he wasn't going to let anything keep him from being a part of her life. But then there was Greg. David didn't trust him. The man seemed more interested in winning than in what was best for Emily. That much was clear in court. David tapped his pen against the desk, considering his next move. He had to remain impartial in the custody case, but his personal connection to Emily changed everything. Would stepping aside be the right thing to do? Or would that leave Sarah and Emily vulnerable to Greg's relentless pursuit? He was still lost in thought when his clerk, Janice, knocked on the door. "Long day?" "Huh," she said, stepping inside. David nodded, running a hand through his hair. "That's an understatement." Janice hesitated before speaking. "You're a good man, David. You'll figure this out." Her words offered a small measure of comfort, but the weight of the situation remained. The next morning, Sarah received an email that made her stomach drop. Greg's legal team had filed a motion to seek emergency custody of Emily, claiming Sarah's newly revealed lies made her an unstable parent. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Sarah's hands shook as she read the email. "How could he stoop so low?" she muttered under her breath. Emily wandered into the room, her hair still messy from sleep. "What's wrong, Mommy?" she asked, sensing Sarah's distress. Sarah quickly closed the laptop and smiled. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetie. How about pancakes for breakfast?" Emily's face lit up, and she ran to grab her plate, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. As the week passed, Sarah prepared for the emergency custody hearing while trying to shield Emily from the tension. She spent hours gathering evidence to prove she was a fit mother, testimonies from friends, teachers, and daycare staff, along with records of her steady work history. David, too, was preparing. Though he couldn't officially involve himself in the custody proceedings, he quietly used his resources to look into Greg's background. What he found surprised him. Greg's financial empire, which had always seemed so untouchable, wasn't as solid as it appeared. Several lawsuits and debts loomed in the background, and whispers of unethical business practices raised serious questions about his character. David knew this information could be crucial, but how could he reveal it without appearing biased? The day of the emergency hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Emily sat quietly beside Sarah, clutching her bunny, while Greg's lawyers presented their case with ruthless precision. They painted Sarah as deceitful and unstable, emphasizing her failure to disclose Emily's paternity. Sarah's lawyer countered by highlighting her dedication as a mother and pointing out Greg's lack of involvement in Emily's life until recently. But the courtroom was electric, with emotions running high on both sides. David watched from the judge's bench, his expression unreadable. Though another judge had been assigned to this particular hearing, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. Emily's future was at stake, and he couldn't stand the thought of her being caught in the crossfire. As the hearing reached its peak, Greg took the stand. His demeanor was calm and confident as he spoke about his desire to provide Emily with a better life. But as Sarah listened, her frustration boiled over. "You've never cared about Emily before," she burst out, her voice trembling with anger. This is just another way for you to control me. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and the judge banged the gavel to restore order. Miss Turner, please contain yourself, he warned. Greg smirked, clearly enjoying Sarah's outburst. But his confidence wavered when Sarah's lawyer presented a surprise piece of evidence, a sworn statement from one of Greg's former employees detailing his unethical behavior. Greg's face darkened as the lawyer read aloud from the document. Mr. Mitchell, would you care to explain these allegations? The opposing lawyer asked. Greg stammered, his usual composure slipping. This has nothing to do with custody, he snapped. On the contrary, Sarah's lawyer countered. It speaks directly to your character, which is highly relevant when determining what's best for Emily. The hearing ended without a final decision, the judge promising to deliberate further before issuing a ruling. As Sarah left the courtroom, she felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like Greg's facade was beginning to crack. But as she and Emily walked to their car, a shadow loomed over them. Greg appeared, his face twisted with anger. You think this is over? He hissed. You're going to regret dragging my name through the mud? Sarah stood her ground, holding Emily's hand tightly. I'm not afraid of you, Greg. Do whatever you want, but I'm not backing down. Greg sneered, his voice low and threatening. We'll see about that. As he walked away, Sarah's resolve only grew stronger. She wouldn't let Greg's threat scare her. She had Emily, and now she had the truth on her side. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was planning something far worse than legal battles. What would he do next? And would Sarah be ready to face it? The tension only escalated in the days following the custody hearing. Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Greg's anger would manifest in more sinister ways. He wasn't just someone who fought fair. He was someone who fought to win, no matter the cost. Emily, blissfully unaware of the storm surrounding her, was excitedly preparing for her upcoming birthday. She spoke about the balloons she wanted, the cupcakes they would bake, and how she hoped Judge David might come. Mommy, can he come? Emily asked one evening as she helped Sarah sort through paper decorations. Sarah paused, considering the question. I don't know, sweetheart, she said carefully. He's very busy with his job, but I know he'd love to see you happy. Emily smiled, nodding. Maybe we can save him some cake if he can't come. Sarah pulled Emily into a hug, her heart aching. The innocence of her little girl was something she would fight to protect at any cost. Meanwhile, David Lawson was dealing with a storm of his own. The revelation of his paternity was no longer a private matter. It had started to spread through the legal community. Colleagues approached him with questions, some congratulatory, others probing for gossip. The weight of the scrutiny only added to his growing sense of responsibility. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and Emily. The idea of being a father was daunting, but it was also strangely exciting. For years, his life had been defined by work and routine. Now, for the first time, he felt a spark of something more, hope. Still, there was the matter of Greg. David had taken it upon himself to dig deeper into Greg's past, and what he found was disturbing. Financial fraud, coercion, and even rumors of violence were buried in Greg's history. Though much of it wasn't officially documented, it painted a picture of a man willing to cross any line to get what he wanted. David knew he had to tread carefully. If he used this information improperly, it could jeopardize the custody case. But if he stayed silent, it could put Emily and Sarah in danger. The turning point came late one night when Sarah was awakened by the sound of her phone buzzing. Groggy and disoriented, she reached for it, her heart sinking when she saw Greg's name flashing on the screen. She hesitated before answering, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. What do you want, Greg? His voice on the other end was calm, almost chillingly so. You should know when to quit, Sarah. It's not too late to drop this case. If you don't, things might get difficult for you. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Is that a threat? She asked, her voice rising. It's a warning, Greg replied smoothly. Think about Emily. You wouldn't want her to lose everything because of your stubbornness. Sarah's stomach churned as she ended the call. She paced the room, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The idea of Greg's threats turning into action terrified her, but she refused to let him intimidate her. That night, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't face this alone. Early the next morning, she called David. David agreed to meet Sarah at a small cafe, away from the prying eyes of the courthouse. When she arrived, he was already seated, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "What's going on?" he asked as she sat down. Sarah recounted Greg's late-night call, her voice trembling. "I'm scared, David. I don't know what he's capable of, and I can't let Emily get caught in the middle." David's jaw tightened. "Greg doesn't scare me," he said firmly. "If he tries anything, we'll deal with it. But I need you to trust me, Sarah. Let me help you." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she nodded. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," David said, his voice softening. "This isn't just about Emily anymore. It's about making sure she has the life she deserves." For the next few days, Sarah and David worked together to strengthen her case. David connected her with resources to ensure she had legal support, while also quietly gathering more information on Greg's activities. Emily, oblivious to the tense preparations, was focused on her birthday. She spent hours drawing invitations, carefully addressing one to Judge David with a big smiley face. "I'm going to give this to him myself," she announced proudly. Sarah couldn't help but smile, though her heart ached at the thought of the challenges they were facing. Then came the night everything changed. Sarah had just tucked Emily into bed when she noticed her living room window was slightly open. A cold breeze blew through the room, making her shiver. She was sure she had closed it earlier. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. When she picked it up, her heart sank. It was a message from an unknown number, but the words sent chills down her spine. "You should lock your doors. Accidents happen." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked around the room, every shadow suddenly feeling menacing. She rushed to double-check the locks on every window and door, her hands trembling. After ensuring everything was secure, she sat on the couch, clutching her phone. She didn't sleep that night, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Greg behind this? And if so, what would he do next? The next morning, Sarah called David, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. He didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over," he said. "We need to figure out a plan." When David arrived, he immediately inspected the house, his calm demeanor helping to steady Sarah's nerves. But as he looked around, his expression grew more serious. "This isn't just about the custody case anymore," he said. "This is about safety. We need to involve the authorities." Sarah hesitated. "What if they don't believe me? Greg has a way of making himself look untouchable." "They'll believe you," David said firmly. "And if they don't, I'll make sure they do." As they sat down to discuss their next steps, Sarah felt a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. But deep down, she knew the battle was far from over. David wasted no time. He contacted the local police and explained the situation, including the threatening message Sarah had received. An officer arrived later that afternoon to take Sarah's statement. While the officer assured her they would look into it, his skeptical tone left her feeling uneasy. "It could just be a prank," the officer said, jotting down notes. "But we'll increase patrols in your area just to be safe." "Just a prank?" David interjected, his voice sharp. "This isn't something to dismiss lightly. There's a custody case underway, and Greg Mitchell has a history of intimidation." The officer's expression hardened. "We'll take it seriously, Judge Lawson," he said, addressing David formally. "But without direct evidence, there's only so much we can do." As the officer left, Sarah turned to David, her nerves frayed. What if they don't find anything? What if Greg keeps pushing until something happens? David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to let it come to that. You're not alone in this, Sarah." The following days were tense. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, even during seemingly mundane moments like walking Emily to school or grocery shopping. Every shadow felt like a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential danger. David began stopping by more often, not just to check on Sarah and Emily, but to make his presence known. He hoped that if Greg truly was behind the threats, seeing him there would deter any further action. Emily, meanwhile, was blissfully focused on her upcoming birthday party. She spent her days drawing pictures of balloons, cakes, and guests, oblivious to the undercurrent of fear that gripped her mother. One evening, As David was leaving their house, Emily tugged on his hand. "Are you coming to my party?" she asked, her big eyes hopeful. David crouched down to her level, his usual stern demeanor softening. "If it's okay with your mom, I'd love to come," he said. Sarah, standing nearby, nodded with a small smile. "It's more than okay," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Emily beamed. "I'm going to save you the biggest piece of cake." The day of the party arrived, and for a few hours, Sarah allowed herself to forget about Greg and the custody battle. Their tiny apartment was decorated with streamers and balloons, and Emily's friends filled the space with laughter and energy. David arrived with a wrapped gift in hand, his presence immediately lighting up Emily's face. "You came!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. He smiled, returning her hug. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss it." As the party went on, David watched Sarah interact with the children, her natural warmth and kindness evident in every gesture. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for the years he'd missed out on knowing her and Emily. But today wasn't a day for regret. It was a day to celebrate. Just as the party was winding down, the doorbell rang. Sarah, assuming it was another parent coming to pick up their child, opened the door without hesitation. But her smile faded instantly when she saw Greg standing there. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. Greg stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on David. His smirk widened. "Well, isn't this cozy?" The judge playing house with his new little family. David stepped forward, his expression unreadable but his posture protective. "You're not welcome here, Greg. You need to leave." Greg ignored him, his focus shifting to Emily, who was clutching her stuffed bunny and staring at him warily. "Happy birthday, kiddo," he said with a tone that was meant to sound kind but came off as unsettling. Emily moved closer to Sarah, sensing the tension. "Mommy, who is he?" she whispered. Sarah's heart broke at the fear in Emily's voice. "He's leaving," she said firmly, stepping between Greg and her daughter. Greg's smirk faltered, and for a moment, his true nature showed. His eyes darkened, and his voice took on a sharp edge. "You don't get to keep her from me, Sarah. This isn't over." Before anyone could respond, David stepped in front of Sarah, his voice cold and commanding. "I think you've said enough, Greg. Leave now, or I'll make sure this goes on record." Greg glared at him, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The party ended on a somber note, the earlier joy overshadowed by Greg's appearance. After the guests left, Sarah sat on the couch, her head in her hands. David sat beside her, his voice gentle. "You did great," he said. "Emily saw how strong you are." Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with worry. "But how do I protect her from someone like him? He's not going to stop." David's jaw tightened. "Then we won't stop either. I'll do everything in my power to make sure Greg doesn't hurt you or Emily." That night, after Emily was tucked safely into bed, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture message, a photo of Emily taken from outside their apartment window. Beneath it was a single line of text. "She belongs to me." Sarah's blood ran cold. She showed the message to David, her hands shaking. He took the phone, his expression grim. "This changes everything," he said. "We're going to the police. Now." The battle with Greg had just taken a terrifying turn, and Sarah knew the fight for her daughter's safety was far from over. But with David by her side, she felt a spark of hope. Hope that they could protect Emily and finally put an end to Greg's reign of fear. Sarah and David arrived at the police station that night, the unsettling photo and message still fresh in their minds. The station was quiet, with only a few officers milling about, but the tension between them was palpable. Sarah clutched her phone tightly, her thoughts racing. What kind of person would stoop so low as to send such a chilling threat? When they were ushered into a small office, an officer took their statements. David, as calm and authoritative as ever, laid out the situation, emphasizing Greg's erratic behavior and history of intimidation. "This isn't just about custody anymore," David said, his voice steady but firm. "This is a threat to Sarah and Emily's safety. We need immediate action." The officer nodded, his expression serious. We'll open an investigation and assign a patrol to keep an eye on the apartment, he assured them. And if you feel unsafe, we can connect you with resources for temporary relocation. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought of uprooting Emily, especially when she had no idea how far Greg was willing to go. But the officer's next words struck an even deeper chord. If you can prove Greg sent this message, we can escalate the case. Do you have any evidence tying him to it? Sarah exchanged a look with David, her hope faltering. The message had come from an untraceable number. We'll do what we can, the officer said, sensing their unease. But without direct proof, it's difficult to take further action. As they drove back to the apartment, Sarah stared out the window, her thoughts heavy. What if they can't stop him? She asked quietly. What if he keeps pushing until he gets what he wants? David, his hands steady on the wheel, glanced at her. We won't let it come to that. We'll find another way to protect you and Emily. The following day, David met with a private investigator he trusted, a retired detective named Hank Riley. Hank was a burly man with a gruff demeanor, but his reputation for uncovering the truth was unmatched. I need you to dig into Greg Mitchell, David said as they sat in Hank's cluttered office. Anything you can find, financials, communications, connections. We need leverage, and we need proof he's behind these threats. Hank leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing. Sounds like this guy's a real piece of work. Don't worry, Judge. I'll find something. While Hank began his investigation, Sarah tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Emily. She took her to school, cooked her favorite meals, and even planned a day at the park to distract her from the mounting tension. But no matter how hard she tried, the fear lingered in the back of her mind. One afternoon, as Sarah and Emily were walking home from the park, a black car crept slowly down the street behind them. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder, gripping Emily's hand tighter. The car passed them without stopping, but the incident left her shaken. That night, Sarah double-checked every lock on the doors and windows. She didn't tell Emily about the car, but she could feel the weight of her daughter's questions. Emily was too perceptive not to notice her mom's fear. "Mommy, is everything okay?" Emily asked as Sarah tucked her into bed. Sarah forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. You don't have to worry about anything." Emily nodded, clutching her stuffed bunny. "You'll keep me safe, right?" "Always," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Hank called David, his tone triumphant. "I've got something for you." David met Hank at his office, where the investigator laid out his findings. "Greg's been making some shady deals," Hank explained. "He's got connections to a few unsavory characters, including a known hacker. This guy's been tied to harassment cases before, and guess what? He recently received a large payment from one of Greg's accounts." David's jaw tightened. "Do you have proof?" Hank handed over a folder filled with documents. "Bank transfers, communications, everything you need to show Greg's been pulling the strings." David stared at the evidence, his mind racing. With this, they could finally prove Greg's involvement in the threats. But would it be enough to stop him? David and Sarah met with the police again, this time armed with Hank's findings. The officer reviewing the evidence looked impressed. "This is solid," he said. "We'll bring Greg in for questioning and see where it leads." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by lingering fear. Greg wasn't the type to back down easily. If he realized the walls were closing in, what might he do? The confrontation came sooner than expected. 2 days after the police brought Greg in for questioning, he showed up outside Sarah's apartment. She spotted him through the window, pacing back and forth, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. David was already on his way over, but Sarah's heart pounded as she watched Greg. She quickly called the police, reporting his presence. Emily, sensing her mom's unease, stayed close, her bunny clutched tightly in her arms. When Greg finally noticed Sarah watching him, he shouted, "You think you've won? This isn't over." Before Sarah could respond, flashing lights appeared down the street. A police car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Greg hesitated, then turned and bolted down the sidewalk. The officers pursued him, and moments later, David arrived, his face set with determination. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping inside. Sarah nodded, though her hands were trembling. "He was here. He said it wasn't over." David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Sarah. We've got the evidence. The police will handle him now." The police caught Greg that evening, charging him with harassment and intimidation. Though the custody case was still unresolved, the immediate danger was finally behind them. Sarah felt a wave of relief, but she knew the fight wasn't entirely over. There were still legal battles ahead, and the road to stability would be long. But as she sat with David and Emily that evening, watching her daughter laugh and play without fear, Sarah felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. With David's support and the truth finally on her side, she believed they could build a better future, one step at a time. With Greg in custody, a fragile sense of calm returned to Sarah and Emily's lives. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt she could breathe. The police had assured her that Greg's actions, coupled with the evidence David and Hank had gathered, would weigh heavily against him in court. Still, the custody case loomed, and Sarah knew Greg wouldn't give up so easily. David became an even more prominent figure in their lives, visiting regularly and offering both emotional and practical support. Emily adored him, often dragging him into her games or asking him endless questions about his life as a judge. "Do you put bad guys in jail?" she asked one afternoon, her eyes wide with curiosity. David chuckled. "Sometimes, but mostly, I help people solve problems." Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. "Are you going to help us solve our problem?" David's smile softened, and he glanced at Sarah before answering. "That's what I'm here for." As the next custody hearing approached, Sarah worked tirelessly with her lawyer to prepare. She was determined to show the court that she was a capable, loving mother who had done everything in her power to protect Emily. The evidence against Greg, along with his recent arrest, bolstered her case, but the stakes still felt impossibly high. Meanwhile, David wrestled with his own role in the situation. Though he wasn't presiding over the case, his connection to Sarah and Emily was becoming harder to keep private. Whispers had begun circulating among his colleagues, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth became public. One evening, as he and Sarah sat in her living room discussing the case, David broached the subject. "Sarah, I need to ask you something." She looked up from her notes, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" "If the court rules in your favor, and I believe they will, what happens next?" he asked carefully. "For you, for Emily, and for us?" Sarah's breath caught. It was a question she'd been avoiding, not because she didn't want an answer, but because the future felt so uncertain. She set her notes aside, meeting his gaze. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know that Emily loves having you around. And so do I." David's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. "I want to be here, Sarah, not just for Emily, but for you. Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, and she nodded. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Sarah sat beside her lawyer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Greg was flanked by his own legal team. Despite his recent arrest, Greg's confidence hadn't faltered. He shot Sarah a smug look as the judge entered the room. The hearing began with opening statements from both sides. Greg's lawyer painted him as a stable, successful businessman who could provide Emily with a life of luxury and opportunity. Sarah's lawyer countered by emphasizing her dedication as a mother and the loving, nurturing environment she had created for Emily. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she spoke from the heart. She described her struggles as a single mother, her commitment to Emily's happiness, and her deep concern for her daughter's safety. "Emily is my world," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Everything I do is for her." The judge nodded thoughtfully, taking notes as she spoke. Then it was Greg's turn. His testimony was polished and rehearsed, but there was an underlying arrogance that didn't go unnoticed. When questioned about the threatening message sent to Sarah, he denied any involvement, blaming it on an overzealous employee. But the evidence Hank had uncovered was damning. Sarah's lawyer presented the documentation, and Greg's composure began to crack. By the time the cross-examination was over, it was clear that his carefully constructed image was unraveling. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge announced that a decision would be made within a week. The room emptied slowly, the tension lingering like a heavy fog. Outside the courthouse, David joined Sarah and Emily, who was clutching his hand tightly. "Did we win, Mommy?" Emily asked, looking up at Sarah with hopeful eyes. Sarah knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We did our best, sweetheart. Now we just have to wait." David placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "No matter what happens, you're not facing this alone." The waiting was excruciating. Each day felt like a lifetime as Sarah replayed the hearing in her mind, second-guessing every word she had spoken. David did his best to keep her spirits up, taking Emily on little outings and helping Sarah prepare for the possibility of further legal battles. Finally, the call came. Sarah's lawyer's voice was calm but firm. "The judge has ruled in your favor, Sarah. You have full custody of Emily." Relief washed over her, and tears streamed down her face as she thanked him. She hung up the phone and turned to Emily, pulling her into a tight hug. "We did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." Later that evening, David joined them for a quiet celebration at home. Emily insisted on baking cookies, and as they sat around the table, laughing and sharing stories, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, the future felt bright. But she knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she, Emily, and David could finally start building the life they deserved. For Sarah, the judge's ruling granting her full custody of Emily was a victory, but it was not the end of her journey. Though Greg was no longer a legal threat, the emotional scars from his years of manipulation and intimidation lingered. She was determined to move forward, not just for Emily, but for herself. David became an even more present figure in their lives, and Sarah welcomed the sense of stability and safety he brought. Emily adored him, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. He wasn't just Judge David to her anymore. He was the man who showed up when it mattered most, someone she instinctively trusted. "Can we go to the zoo with David today?" Emily asked one sunny Saturday morning, her excitement infectious. Sarah smiled. "Why don't we ask him?" David, who had arrived early that morning with coffee for Sarah and a book for Emily, immediately agreed. "I'd love to," he said, his eyes lighting up at Emily's enthusiasm. At the zoo, Emily darted from exhibit to exhibit, her laughter filling the air. Sarah watched her daughter with a mix of joy and relief, grateful for the normalcy returning to their lives. David walked beside her, their hands brushing occasionally as they kept pace with Emily. "She's amazing," David said, his voice filled with admiration. "She really is," Sarah replied, glancing at him. "And she adores you." David hesitated for a moment, then said, "I adore her too. And you." The words hung in the air, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned to him, her expression soft. "David, I don't know what I would have done without you." "You won't have to find out," he said gently. "I'm here, Sarah, for both of you." As life began to settle, Sarah focused on creating a sense of security for Emily. She enrolled her in extracurricular activities, arranged playdates with friends, and even started volunteering at her school. Emily thrived, her natural curiosity and kindness shining through in everything she did. But despite the progress, Sarah couldn't completely shake her fear of Greg. Though he had been ordered to stay away from her and Emily, his presence lingered in her mind like a shadow. David, ever perceptive, noticed her moments of unease. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Emily chase fireflies, he broached the topic. "You're still worried about Greg, aren't you?" he asked gently. Sarah sighed, her gaze fixed on Emily. "I know he's out of the picture legally, but I can't help wondering if he'll find another way to hurt us." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, and I think we should take steps to make sure you feel safe." "What do you mean?" she asked, turning to him. "There are things we can do, security cameras, a better alarm system. Maybe even legal measures to restrict his ability to contact you indirectly." Sarah considered this, then nodded. "I think that would help." "Thank you, David." Over the next few weeks, David helped Sarah implement the changes. They installed cameras around the apartment, upgraded the locks, and worked with a lawyer to ensure Greg couldn't use intermediaries to reach her or Emily. The sense of security that followed was transformative, allowing Sarah to finally relax in her own home. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, Emily brought out a drawing she had made. It showed her, Sarah, and David standing together under a big, sunny sky. "Look, Mommy," Emily said proudly. "This is us. We're a family." Sarah felt her throat tighten as she looked at the drawing, her heart swelling with emotion. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, hugging Emily tightly. David, too, was moved. He reached out, ruffling Emily's hair. "You're quite the artist," he said with a smile. Just as Sarah began to believe their lives had truly turned a corner, an unexpected twist shattered their peace. One afternoon, as she picked Emily up from school, she noticed a figure lingering near the playground. Her heart stopped when she recognized Greg. Though he was under strict orders to stay away, there he was, watching Emily from a distance. Sarah's instincts kicked in, and she quickly ushered Emily into the car. Her hands trembled as she drove away, her mind racing. Why was Greg there? What was he planning? When she arrived home, she immediately called David, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. "He's not supposed to be anywhere near her," she exclaimed. "What do I do?" David's voice was calm but firm. "Call the police, Sarah. He's violating the court order. I'll be there as soon as I can." The police arrived quickly, taking Sarah's statement and filing a report. Though Greg had left the playground by the time they arrived, Sarah provided a description and emphasized the urgency of the situation. David arrived shortly after, his presence a source of immediate comfort. He pulled Sarah into a reassuring hug. "We'll handle this," he said. "You're not alone." That night, as Emily slept peacefully in her room, Sarah and David sat at the kitchen table, discussing their next steps. "I don't understand why he won't stop," Sarah said, her voice filled with frustration. "The court ruled against him. What more does he want?" David's expression was grim. "Some people can't handle losing control, but we're not going to let him intimidate you, Sarah. We'll make sure he faces the consequences." Greg's reappearance reignited Sarah's fears, but it also strengthened her resolve. She wasn't the same person she had been when Greg had first tried to control her life. With David's unwavering support, she was determined to protect Emily at all costs. But as the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's actions were building towards something bigger. What was he planning? And would they be ready when the time came? Sarah couldn't stop replaying the moment she saw Greg near the playground. The image haunted her, filling her with dread. Though the police assured her they were monitoring the situation, she didn't feel reassured. Greg's boldness in defying the court order was a chilling reminder of his unpredictability. David, ever the steady presence, stayed with Sarah and Emily for the next few days. His calming influence made Emily feel safe, and his unwavering support helped Sarah hold herself together. But beneath David's calm demeanor was a growing sense of anger. Greg's refusal to abide by the law wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. "Sarah, I've been thinking," David said one evening as they sat in the living room. Emily was asleep, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. "We need to do more than react. We need to anticipate Greg's next move." Sarah nodded, her hands clutching a mug of tea. "What do you mean?" "I've been talking with Hank," David continued. "He's willing to do some deeper digging into Greg's recent activities. If we can prove he's planning something, or even just find out where he's been, maybe we can stop him before he tries anything else." The mention of Hank gave Sarah a flicker of hope. "You think he'll find something? If Greg is crossing lines, and I'd bet he is, Hank will uncover it," David said firmly. Meanwhile, Greg's appearance at the playground was a stark reminder to Sarah that she couldn't let her guard down. She took extra precautions with Emily, ensuring she wasn't alone for even a moment. She informed the school of the incident, and they agreed to tighten security around the premises. Emily, blissfully unaware of the tension, focused on the small joys in her life. She spent her days drawing pictures, building forts with David, and planning an elaborate pretend picnic for her stuffed animals. Her innocence was both a comfort and a painful reminder of what Sarah was fighting to protect. 2 days later, Hank called David with news. "I've got something," he said, his voice low and serious. Greg's been in contact with some questionable people, again. One of them is a private investigator, and it looks like he hired him to dig up dirt on Sarah. David's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of dirt? Anything he can use against her, Hank replied. Financial records, old relationships, even stuff about Emily. The guy's relentless. David's jaw clenched. Can you track this investigator? I'm already on it, Hank said. But Greg's covering his tracks better this time. It's going to take a little longer. Keep me updated, David said, his voice firm. When he relayed the information to Sarah, her face paled. He's trying to ruin me, she said quietly. He can't stand that he lost. He can try, David said, his tone unwavering. But he won't succeed. We'll stay ahead of him. The next morning, Sarah received a troubling email. It was from an anonymous sender, but the content was unmistakable. Attached was a series of old photos, pictures of Sarah from years ago, with people she hadn't seen in ages. Accompanying the images was a message. How much more do you want to lose? Sarah showed the email to David, her hands trembling. How did he get these? She whispered. David's expression darkened. It has to be the investigator Hank mentioned. Greg's trying to scare you into backing down. Well, it's working, Sarah admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. What if he keeps escalating? What if he comes after Emily again? David took her hands, his voice steady and reassuring. He won't. We're going to shut this down, Sarah. I promise. David called Hank immediately, sharing the details of the email. Hank assured him that he was closing in on the investigator, but in the meantime, David knew they couldn't wait for the situation to escalate further. David reached out to a contact in law enforcement, an old friend named Detective Morgan. After explaining the situation, Morgan agreed to prioritize the case. If Greg's crossing legal boundaries, we'll find out, Morgan promised. But make sure Sarah stays alert. A cornered man is a dangerous one. Later that evening, David sat with Sarah on the porch as Emily played inside. The sunset painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, but the weight of their conversation darkened the moment. You're doing everything right, Sarah, David said gently. Greg's desperation shows that he's losing control. He's running out of options. Sarah nodded, though her worry was evident. I just want this to be over, she said, her voice breaking. I want Emily to feel safe. I want to feel safe. David reached for her hand, his touch grounding. We'll get there. Together. That night, Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911. David, who had stayed over on the couch, was already on his feet, moving toward the noise. Stay with Emily, he instructed, his voice firm but calm. Sarah hurried to Emily's room, finding her still asleep despite the commotion. She locked the door and sat beside her, holding her close as her mind raced. Downstairs, David found the source of the noise, a broken window in the kitchen. Shards of glass littered the floor, and a rock lay in the center of the room. Attached to it was a note, scrawled in messy handwriting. You can't keep her from me. By the time the police arrived, Sarah was shaking with fear, and Emily, now awake, clung to her bunny. The officers surveyed the scene, taking the note and the rock as evidence. This is a clear violation of the restraining order, one officer said. We'll do everything we can to track him down. As the night wore on, Sarah's fear turned into anger. She looked at David, her voice trembling but resolute. This has to stop, David. Whatever it takes, we have to end this. David nodded, his expression grim. We will, he said. Greg's just made his last mistake. The broken window and threatening note marked a turning point for Sarah. Her fear, once paralyzing, now fueled her determination to protect Emily and end Greg's harassment once and for all. She refused to let him control her life any longer. David stayed at Sarah's side, working tirelessly with Detective Morgan and Hank to tighten the net around Greg. The police stepped up their patrols near her home, and Sarah began to feel a small measure of safety return. But the rock through the window had made one thing clear. Greg was growing desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. Hank called with an update a few days later, his voice urgent. I've tracked down the investigator Greg hired, he said. The guy's been digging through Sarah's past, but more importantly, I found proof that Greg paid him to send that email and take those photos. David exhaled sharply. That's enough to bring Greg back into court. It gets worse, Hank continued. Greg's also been meeting with a guy who has a record for illegal surveillance. It's possible he's been watching Sarah or even Emily. David's jaw tightened. Send me everything you have. The evidence Hank uncovered was damning. Bank transfers, text messages, and even a recorded phone call between Greg and the investigator painted a clear picture of his illegal activities. David handed the evidence to Detective Morgan, who moved swiftly to issue a warrant for Greg's arrest. But Greg, aware that the walls were closing in, had already disappeared. For several tense days, Greg's whereabouts remained unknown. Sarah kept Emily close, rarely leaving the house and never letting her out of her sight. David took leave from work to stay with them, his presence a constant source of reassurance. One night, as they sat in the living room, Sarah turned to David, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. I don't know how I'd get through this without you, she said softly. You're stronger than you think, Sarah, David replied. But you're not alone anymore. You never will be. The breakthrough came when Detective Morgan called with news. We found Greg, he said. He's been staying at a motel on the outskirts of town. We're moving in now to arrest him. Relief flooded Sarah, but it was tempered by apprehension. What if he doesn't stop even after this? She asked David. He won't have the chance, David assured her. With everything he's done, he's looking at serious charges. This isn't just about custody anymore. This is about criminal behavior. Greg's arrest made headlines the next day. He was charged with harassment, violating a restraining order, and conspiracy to commit illegal surveillance. The weight of the evidence against him left little room for defense, and his legal team scrambled to negotiate a plea deal. For Sarah, the news brought a profound sense of relief. The man who had terrorized her for so long was finally facing justice. But even as the immediate threat was removed, she knew there was still work to do to rebuild her and Emily's sense of safety. As the weeks passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Emily, blissfully unaware of the full extent of what had happened, returned to her carefree self. She started drawing pictures again, often featuring herself, Sarah, and David as a happy family. One evening, as Sarah tucked her into bed, Emily looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. Mommy, does this mean the bad man is gone forever? Sarah hesitated, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. It means we're safe now, sweetheart, she said. And we're going to be okay. Emily smiled, hugging her bunny tightly. I knew you'd keep me safe. In the weeks following Greg's arrest, David and Sarah's relationship deepened. They spent more time together as a family, creating memories that weren't overshadowed by fear or uncertainty. David's connection with Emily grew stronger, and Sarah found herself daring to dream of a future where happiness wasn't fleeting. One afternoon, as they sat in the park watching Emily play, David turned to Sarah. I've been thinking, he began, his tone serious but warm. Emily's already started calling me Dad sometimes. And I'd like to make that official. Sarah's breath caught. What are you saying? I want to be part of your lives, David said. For real. Forever. I want to adopt Emily, if that's something you'd want too. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she nodded. Of course we want that. You're already her dad in every way that matters. David smiled, his heart full. Then let's make it official. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah, Emily, and David began laying the foundation for their new life. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined them. Together, they were building something stronger, a family forged in resilience, love, and hope. But just when it seemed like everything was falling into place, an unexpected twist threatened to shake their newfound stability. A call came one evening from Detective Morgan, his tone urgent. We've uncovered something new about Greg's activities, he said, and I think you'll want to hear this. Sarah's heart sank as she listened to Detective Morgan on the phone. After everything they'd been through, the idea of more trouble was almost too much to bear. What did you find? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Morgan's tone was measured but serious. We've been combing through Greg's financial records and digital activities. It looks like he set up a trust fund in Emily's name, but not out of kindness. He used it to hide funds connected to some illegal dealings. Sarah's stomach twisted. What does that mean for us? It means Greg's actions could drag Emily into legal complications if we don't act fast, Morgan said. But don't worry, we've already flagged it with the court and the bank. This is something we can handle, but I wanted you to know. Sarah sighed. Relief mingled with frustration. Thank you for telling me. Please keep us updated. When she hung up, David noticed her tense expression. What's going on? He asked. She explained what Morgan had said, and David's face hardened. Greg couldn't manipulate you directly, so he's tried to leave a mess behind. But we'll deal with it. Sarah nodded, taking strength from his confidence. I just want it all to be over. It will be, David assured her. One step at a time. Over the next few weeks, Sarah worked with Morgan and the courts to untangle the financial web Greg had left behind. Though it was exhausting, Sarah felt a sense of empowerment in standing up to him, even posthumously, in a way. She wasn't the scared, submissive woman Greg had once controlled. She was stronger now, and she wasn't facing the battle alone. The courts ruled that the trust fund was fraudulent and dissolved it. Any lingering legal issues tied to Greg were resolved, and Sarah was officially cleared of any connection to his crimes. Finally, she could breathe again. As the dust settled, life began to blossom in ways Sarah hadn't imagined possible. The adoption process for David to officially become Emily's father moved forward, and the day of the court hearing was a moment of pure joy. Emily, dressed in a bright yellow dress, clung to David's hand as they stood before the judge. Do you want David to be your dad? The judge asked Emily gently. Emily beamed, nodding enthusiastically. He's already my dad, she said, her voice clear and confident. The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter, and the judge smiled. Well then, it's official. Congratulations. David knelt down to Emily's level, tears glistening in his eyes. Thank you for letting me be your dad, he said. You're the best dad, Emily replied, throwing her arms around him. The years that followed were filled with the kind of happiness Sarah had once thought was out of reach. Emily thrived, surrounded by love and support. She excelled in school, made lifelong friends, and often declared that her favorite thing in the world was spending time with her mom and dad. Sarah, too, found a new sense of purpose. She began volunteering with organizations that supported single mothers and survivors of domestic abuse, using her own experiences to help others find strength and hope. David continued his work as a judge, but his greatest joy came from being with his family. Every evening, he, Sarah, and Emily would sit down to dinner together, sharing stories and laughter. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. One night, as Sarah and David sat on the porch watching Emily chase fireflies, Sarah turned to him with a smile. Did you ever think life would turn out like this? She asked. David shook his head, his expression filled with warmth. Not in my wildest dreams. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that their story, though marked by hardship, had led them to a place of love, resilience, and joy. And as Emily's laughter filled the evening air, Sarah knew they had found what they had been searching for all along, a family that was whole, happy, and finally at peace.